like all of the records of the National Archives is the repository of what are determined to be the permanently valuable records of the government, which is a very, very small percentage of the total that's actually created by the government. So these were photographic collections made by or acquired by the government of the United States. One of the fabulous collections of this nature that the archives owns is a collection of Ansel Adams photographs, which were the property of the National Park Service. The National Park Service hired Ansel Adams in the late 1930s to do a photographic survey of the national parks. They paid him $75 for each print that he produced, and he produced these absolutely spectacular 16 by 20 prints. He actually did the printing for every one of these, which was his great art, according to people who've studied Ansel Adams. And there were about 150 of them that he produced. And I remember on one occasion, he contacted us and asked if he could come in and take a look at the pictures. He hadn't seen them since he produced them, 60 years earlier. So he came with an entourage of 3 or 4 aides, and we brought out the collection for him to look at them. And I remember as he was going through them, every so often, his main aide, this young woman, would gasp and said, "Oh, Ansel, why did you ever give them that one?" I consider myself very fortunate that I just happened to end up in what was probably the most interesting place within the National Archives. And I decided it was time, I needed a change from that too. And so I talked to my boss, who was the head of this office, and it just so happens was also the same person who had hired me in the still picture branch 20 years earlier. So I had worked with him for a long time, and he was a very good person who looked out for his staff in every way he could. And so he arranged for me to do a detail, as they call it in government, to the National Security Council, which was something I had never anticipated. But I was eager for a change, so I made it. And after a few years, I became a National Security Council employee and stayed there for a total of 20 years. And it was the best move I ever made in my life because, while challenging in many ways, there was never a dull day. Because of, the National Security Council, just for those who may not be familiar with the National Security Council, is a very small staff of the president within the White House. It's about 200 people. That was about the size when I was there. It's probably slightly larger now, but not much. And well over half of the staff of the National Security Council are detailees from other agencies, national security agencies like the State Department or the CIA or the Defense Department. And they essentially provide the traditional staff work for the president on any issue related to national security, foreign affairs. They write all the memos that go to the president, setting up a decision on the issue of the day. State Department recommends X, the CIA recommends Y, here's our assessment of the situation, and here's our recommendation about what you should or should not do, Mr. President. Given the nature of the work, virtually all of the records, the overwhelming majority of the records, are classified when they are created or when they are received. Anything created by the National Security Council staff or received by the National Security Council staff, and there's a lot of the latter that's sent in, is regarded as a record. And indeed, it's regarded by the National Archives, with very, very, very few exceptions. All of this material that is created or received by the staff of the National Security Council is regarded as a permanent archival record, which means it is meant by law to be transferred to the custody of the National Archives at the end of any given administration. And as I was saying, because of the nature of the work, virtually everything is regarded as classified. And that means, among other things, that everyone who works for the National Security Council staff must have a very high level clearance, top secret, SCI as it's called, secret, sensitive compartmented information is SCI, that's mainly intelligence records from the CIA. So it's a given. Everything is treated as if it's classified. And everything is also treated as if it's a permanently valuable record that transfers to the custody of the National Archives at the end of an administration. Now that latter assumption is different from the traditional practice regarding presidential records until Watergate. And the one of the consequences of many consequences of Watergate was the passage of the Presidential Records Act in 1978, which established that all records created by a president or a presidency within the White House were presidential records owned by the government, not owned by the president. Prior to the Presidential Records Act, up through Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter, all those records were their personal property. You know, the key principles as they relate, for example, to some of the recent news about the handling of White House records. The key principles are that, one, they belong to the government, they don't belong to the individual president, and almost without exception, they're classified. And there are very detailed rules about how classified records must be protected, and can never, for example, be stored in a hotel storage closet. There are three levels of classification: confidential, secret, top secret. Making that distinction is an art, not a skill. There's lots of room for debate about any kind of decision like this, and so traditionally, I think it's fair to say, most people err on the side of classifying too much, classifying it too high, and keeping it classified much too long. And there is an executive order, 13528, I think is the current executive order, which was issued by President Obama. I was in charge of the process that wrote that executive order. And neither Trump nor Bush has chosen to write a new executive. Most presidents write a new executive order, make some changes, but neither Trump nor Biden has chosen to write a new executive order. So the Obama order is the one that prevails, and I think it's fair to say that it was the most pro-disclosure executive order ever written. But it still doesn't go far enough. The government spends, I mean, there are roughly 4 million government employees, including contractors, who have security clearances, both military and civilian. The government spends about $20 billion a year managing this security classification system. It classifies about 50 million documents every year, declassifies about 45 million, which means there's a very large built-in increase in the total quantity of the classified material, which has to be looked at and declassified at some point. And that process gets really involved because many records, especially White House records, have what's called equities of several different agencies. So even though the document may have been created by the National Security Council staff, if it's a serious document, it's likely to involve the interests, the equities of the CIA, maybe the State Department, maybe the Defense Department. So if the NSC staff wants to declassify that document in whole or in part, they have to refer it out to each of those agencies, ask them for their recommendation. Usually the recommendations won't be the same, so you have to resolve disputes, and not surprisingly, it takes a long time. And I'm sure they were all aghast when the reports first surfaced about the material that had been stored at Mar-a-Lago. The fact that dozens of those documents, at least according to press reports, were classified at the top secret level would give all of them heartburn, because I'm not sure whose records they are. But I would be the first to acknowledge that it would not surprise me if it turns out that much of that information is of little or no consequence, or may very well be material that could be declassified. But it can't be classified by a wave of the hand. As I suggested a bit, there's a very elaborate process for making those decisions and documenting them and enforcing them. And not even a president can properly make that decision without going through this consultation that I just mentioned, and documenting all of that consultation. You're right, it is safe to say that always happens, or I wouldn't be surprised to discover that it always happens. The question is what is done when it's discovered. And there obviously was a difference between what Trump did, for example, and what Biden did in such a case.